When most of us think of ancient Greece, we picture marble temples gleaming under the sun, philosophers debating the meaning of life in the agora, and Olympic athletes racing in glory. Greece is remembered as the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, science, and drama, a cradle of Western civilization. But beneath the marble, beneath the glory, there was another Greece, a Greece of prisons, chains, floggings, and executions. Justice in the Greek world was not abstract. It was not gentle. It was often bloody, humiliating, and terrifying. Ancient Greeks did not have large, complex prison systems like modern states. Punishment had to be visible and immediate. Justice was not hidden behind walls. It was carried out in the marketplace, in the theatre of public life, where citizens gathered to watch. A punishment was as much about sending a message as it was about correcting a crime. And the crimes, they ranged from theft and assault to adultery, blasphemy, treason, and sacrilege. In a society where gods were ever present, impiety could be punished as severely as murder. To insult the gods was to risk the survival of the polis itself. But let's begin at the beginning. What did the Greeks actually mean by justice? Why did they punish? And what philosophies lay behind their lash and their sword? The philosophy of Greek justice, between democracy and vengeance. Greek justice was complicated because Greek society itself was complicated. Across the ancient world, from Athens to Sparta, from Corinth to Thebes, each city-state, or polis, had its own laws, customs, and punishments. Yet there were some common threads that ran through all Greek approaches to crime and justice. For the Greeks, justice was not simply about rules, it was about balance. To commit a crime was to disturb the balance of the community, to tilt the scales of order. Punishment, then, was not just retribution, but a way of restoring harmony. This idea came from both philosophy and religion. To offend another citizen was one thing, to offend the gods was another, and often worse. Crimes like temple robbery or impiety risked divine wrath upon the whole city. Punishment, therefore, was an act not only of justice, but of appeasement. In democratic Athens, justice was woven into the fabric of civic life. Citizens were expected to serve as jurors in people's courts, deciding punishments for criminals. There were no professional judges as we know them today. The people themselves were the law. This gave Athenian justice a strange character. It could be harsh and unpredictable. A jury of hundreds of citizens might sentence one man to exile and another to death for a similar crime, depending on the mood, the rhetoric, or the persuasion of lawyers. Punishment was therefore not just about crime, it was about politics, persuasion, and the theatre of the courtroom. Before the democratic age, Greek law was often extremely harsh. The lawgiver Draco in 7th century BCE Athens became infamous for his severe codes. Almost every crime from theft to murder carried the death penalty. His name even survives today in the word draconian, meaning excessively harsh. Though Draco's laws were eventually reformed, they reveal the Greek mindset. Justice was not gentle correction, but sharp deterrence. To break the law was to invite suffering. While Athens leaned on democracy, Sparta relied on fear. A militarized society obsessed with discipline, Sparta had punishments that fit its warrior culture. Disobedient soldiers might be flogged publicly. Helots, the enslaved population, were treated brutally, sometimes executed without trial if suspected of rebellion. For Spartans, punishment was not just about law, but about reinforcing absolute obedience to the state. A Spartan boy caught stealing food was not punished for theft. He was punished for being caught. This was justice as discipline, training through pain. One of the most striking features of Greek punishment was its emphasis on public shame. Unlike modern justice systems, which often hide punishment from society, Greek justice thrived in visibility. A man fined for corruption might have his name inscribed publicly. A woman accused of adultery might be paraded in humiliation. A thief might be flogged in the agora. The Greeks understood that shame could be as powerful as physical pain, and yet this was also the land of philosophers. Thinkers like Plato and Aristotle debated the purpose of justice. Should punishment be purely retributive, a repayment of harm with harm, or should it be corrective, an attempt to reform the criminal? Plato argued that punishment should aim at improvement, but in practice, Greek punishments often remained brutal. There was always a gap between philosophy and reality. Perhaps the most famous punishment in Greek history was the execution of Socrates. Convicted of impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens, Socrates was sentenced to drink a cup of hemlock poison. His death was not just an execution, it was a political and religious statement. The jury of citizens decided that his words had endangered the city's balance. By killing him, they restored it. This case shows the strange duality of Greek justice. It was democratic, yet harsh, philosophical, yet vengeful. Though the punishments themselves may shock us today, the philosophy behind them still lingers in our systems. The idea that justice restores balance, that trials should be public, that the community has a role in judgment, all of these are Greek legacies. Yet so too is the harshness. From Draco's bloody laws to the poison cup of Socrates, Greek justice shows us that even the cradle of democracy rested on a foundation of fear and punishment. Common crimes and their punishments, from theft to blasphemy. When we strip away the grandeur of temples and the poetry of Homer, we find the everyday life of ancient Greece filled with ordinary disputes, stolen goods, drunken assaults, broken contracts, and insults to the gods. Punishments reflected not only the crime, but the belief that the stability of the entire community was at stake. Every punishment, no matter how small, carried weight far beyond the individual. Theft was one of the most common crimes in ancient Greece, and it was treated with severity. In a world without police as we know them, property crimes were both disruptive and dangerous. A man who stole food, tools, or livestock was not merely depriving his neighbor, he was undermining the delicate trust that bound citizens together. Punishments for theft varied. In some cases, fines were imposed, the thief forced to repay multiple times the value of what he had stolen. But when theft was brazen, repeated, or carried out against sacred property, physical punishments were used. Thieves could be flogged in public, their backs striped with lashes, while crowds jeered. Others faced branding, a permanent mark burned into their skin so that everyone who saw them knew their shame. Some accounts suggest that severe thieves even faced mutilation, hands cut off or maimed to mark their betrayal. The humiliation was as important as the pain. To be branded or flogged in the agora meant carrying the memory of punishment for life, a scar both physical and social. A thief was never truly free again. Adultery was a deeply serious offense in ancient Greece, not merely a private betrayal, but a crime against the household, the family, and the city itself. A wife caught with another man risked not only disgrace, but severe punishment. For men, adultery was tolerated more, yet if they violated another man's household, they too could face consequences. The laws of Athens gave a husband the right to kill a man caught in the act with his wife. This was not considered murder, but justice. Others might humiliate the adulterer instead, stripping him, shaving his genitals, or parading him in public while mocking songs were sung. The punishment was designed to emasculate, to mark him as weak, dishonorable, and forever ridiculed. For women, the punishment was harsher still. A wife accused of adultery could be divorced, cast out of her household, and stripped of her dowry. She might be barred from participating in religious ceremonies, cut off from the sacred rites that bound her to the gods. To lose her place in religion was not just punishment, it was exile from the heart of Greek life. In a world where honor meant everything, assaults and violence were common. A brawl in the agora, a drunken strike in a symposium, or a feud between families could quickly spiral into bloodshed. Greek punishment for violence was varied. Sometimes compensation was demanded, fines paid to the victim's family. But when blood was spilled, the rules changed. A man who killed another, even by accident, could be tried for homicide. If convicted, his punishment could be exile, stripping him from his home and forcing him to wander as an outcast. In more serious cases, execution awaited, for the shedding of blood disturbed not only society, but also the gods. Public beatings were also common for lesser assaults. To be flogged was not just to suffer, but to be humiliated in front of peers. The lash reminded everyone watching that violence against one citizen was an offense against the whole community. Few crimes terrified the Greeks more than impiety. The gods were not distant abstractions. They were living powers, watching, judging, and capable of punishing entire cities for one man's offense. To insult a god, to desecrate a temple, or to introduce new deities was considered one of the gravest crimes imaginable. The punishments for blasphemy were severe. Exile was common, the offender banished from his homeland as a danger to the city's sacred balance. Heavy fines were also imposed, draining the wealth of those who dared disrespect the divine. But when impiety was too great, when it threatened the very favor of the gods, the punishment was death. The most famous example is Socrates himself, condemned for impiety and corrupting the youth. Forced to drink the cup of hemlock, his execution was not simply about philosophy, it was about the city defending itself from what it saw as spiritual rot. His death demonstrates how easily the line between philosophy and blasphemy could blur, and how quickly Greek justice could turn lethal. For certain crimes, especially debts or repeated theft, the punishment was not death, but enslavement. In ancient Greece, slavery was not just a condition of war captives, it was a punishment for citizens who fell too far into disgrace. A man unable to pay his debts might be sold into slavery, his life reduced to servitude until the balance was restored. Criminals too might find themselves condemned to forced labor, stripped of citizenship, dignity, and freedom. To live as a slave in the very city where one had once walked as a free man was perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. Perhaps the most symbolic of Greek punishments was exile. To be cast out of one's city was more than being sent away. It was to lose one's identity. A Greek was nothing without his polis. His rights, his honor, his entire life were tied to the community. Exile meant wandering foreign lands, cut off from family, rituals, and the sacred soil of ancestors. It was sometimes preferred to death, but often described as a fate worse than it. A man in exile was alive, but rootless, stripped of everything that gave life meaning. The theatre of public punishment, shame before the Polis. In ancient Greece, justice was never meant to be hidden. Unlike modern societies which often carry out punishments behind prison walls or inside private chambers, the Greeks believed punishment should be visible, even spectacular. To punish in secret was meaningless. The true purpose of justice was not only to correct the criminal, but to educate the community through fear, shame, and ritual. The agora, the bustling marketplace and civic center, was more than a place for trade and debate. It was also a stage where justice played out. A thief might be flogged there, his cries echoing between the stalls, his humiliation witnessed by merchants, citizens, and slaves alike. The punishment became a shared memory for all who saw it, a living example of what happened to those who violated the rules of the city. Public flogging was not merely physical, it was symbolic. Each lash was an echo of the law itself, striking not only the criminal but also the community's collective memory. A man beaten in the agora could never escape the whispers, the laughter, the pointing fingers. His punishment lived on long after the stripes faded. Shame was a punishment in itself. Greeks were deeply concerned with time, the honor and reputation that defined their place in society. To lose honor was to lose identity. Punishments often exploited this vulnerability by turning criminals into objects of ridicule. An adulterer might be paraded through the streets, stripped and mocked, his humiliation becoming the entertainment of the crowd. Thieves might be branded, their scarred faces permanent symbols of disgrace. For women accused of adultery, exclusion from religious rituals was a deeply humiliating punishment, for it declared them unworthy before the gods. These acts were not hidden. They were staged with deliberate cruelty, ensuring that the community saw the offender's downfall. The punishment was not just pain, it was a performance, and the audience was the polis itself. Trials in Athens themselves were public spectacles. Juries could number in the hundreds, drawn from ordinary citizens. Speeches were delivered not just to argue facts, but to sway emotions, to entertain, to perform. The courtroom was as much theatre as law, and punishment was its climax. When a jury voted to exile a man, fine him, or execute him, the decision was not whispered in private chambers. It was shouted, celebrated, and remembered. The punishment was woven into the collective drama of the city. When punishments escalated to death, the spectacle became even more powerful. In Athens, executions were often carried out in front of citizens, sometimes by stoning, sometimes by poison. The condemned man did not die alone. He died in the gaze of the polis. The death penalty, from stoning to hemlock. Death in ancient Greece was not simply the end of a life. It was the most powerful weapon the city could wield. To kill a citizen was to declare him beyond redemption, beyond forgiveness, beyond belonging. The methods varied, but each carried with it symbolism, terror, and ritual. Stoning was one of the most ancient and communal forms of execution. It was used primarily for crimes considered to pollute the community, blasphemy, sacrilege, or extreme betrayal. The condemned was not executed by a single hand, but by many. The symbolism was clear. The community itself rejected the offender. Every stone thrown was a declaration that the criminal had no place among them. To be stoned was to be erased by the very society one had wronged. The punishment was slow and brutal. A single stone might wound, but not kill. Dozens of stones, hurled by neighbors and peers, broke bones, split flesh, and eventually silenced breath. To die by stoning was to die not only in agony but in shame, destroyed under the weight of collective rejection. Another grim form of death penalty was being thrown from a cliff. In Athens, certain criminals were hurled from the Barathron, a rocky pit outside the city. This was not only an execution, but a symbolic expulsion, a casting away of the criminal from the sacred soil of the polis. To be thrown from the cliff was to be violently removed from the community. Your body, smashed against stone, symbolized your severing from the world of the living and the world of the city alike. The fall itself was part of the ritual. The community cast you down, and the earth itself finished the punishment. Though less common in Greece than in other ancient cultures, burning was occasionally used for extreme crimes, often tied to sacrilege. To burn a man alive was to obliterate him completely, reducing his body to ash, leaving nothing for burial. This was a punishment not only of death, but of erasure. In a culture where burial and honor for the dead were sacred, to be denied a grave was the ultimate dishonor. Burning removed the criminal not only from life, but from memory. In some cases, torture preceded execution. Slaves in particular were often tortured to extract confessions before their deaths. Their screams were part of the punishment, part of the spectacle. For citizens, torture was less common, but when betrayal or treason was suspected, pain was a prelude to death. Perhaps the most iconic Greek execution was death by poison, most famously the cup of hemlock given to Socrates in 399 BCE. This method was seen as more dignified, more orderly, especially for citizens. It avoided bloodshed, avoided spectacle, and allowed the condemned to die with composure. The process was simple but cruel. The condemned was given a cup of hemlock, a deadly poison. As it spread through the body, paralysis set in, beginning with the feet and rising upward until it reached the lungs and heart. The victim remained conscious, slowly losing control of his body until death overtook him. Socrates' death turned this punishment into legend. Surrounded by his students, he calmly drank the poison, spoke his final words, and lay down to die. His composure transformed a punishment into a philosophical lesson, but the method itself remained brutal. To suffocate slowly, aware of one's body failing, was no gentle end. In the Greek mind, executions were not only about vengeance or deterrence, they were acts of purification. Crimes like murder, sacrilege, or blasphemy were thought to pollute the city, bringing divine anger upon all. To kill the criminal was to cleanse the polis, to restore balance between man and God. This is why executions often carried ritual elements. They were not just punishments, they were sacrifices, offerings to the gods of justice and order. In some trials, the condemned might be given a choice: exile or death. For some, exile was the harsher punishment, stripping them of homeland and identity. Others chose death, preferring to leave life on their own soil rather than wander in shame. Socrates himself was offered the chance to propose an alternative to death: exile, silence, or fine. He refused, declaring he would not abandon philosophy. His choice sealed his fate, but also immortalized him as a martyr for truth. Slaves, women, and foreigners, how punishment differed by status. For all its reputation as the cradle of democracy, ancient Greece was never a land of equality. Democracy was reserved for male citizens, a small minority of the population. The majority, women, slaves, and foreigners, lived under laws that treated them very differently. Their punishments revealed just how sharply the lines of privilege and vulnerability were drawn. Slaves were the most vulnerable of all. Considered property, they had no legal rights of their own. If a slave committed a crime, the punishment was not a matter of debate or jury, but the decision of their master. A master could beat a slave, brand him, sell him, or even execute him without trial. When slaves were suspected of serious crimes, especially those involving their masters or the city, torture was routine. Unlike citizens whose testimony could not be extracted under duress, slaves were considered unreliable unless tortured. Their screams were seen as truth itself, the body forced to confess what the tongue might hide. For runaway slaves, punishments could be especially cruel. Some were branded with hot irons, marked permanently as fugitives. Others were shackled, forced to wear heavy collars with inscriptions like, "Stop me, I am a runaway." The humiliation was not just for the slave, it was a warning to all others. And yet, the harshest punishments for slaves were often not about crime, but fear of rebellion. The memory of uprisings, whether in Greece itself or in later Rome, made masters quick to punish even whispers of resistance. Execution, crucifixion, and mass floggings were tools of terror designed to keep the enslaved population silent. For women, punishment was less about the lash and more about honor and control. Women were excluded from political life, confined largely to the household, and judged above all by their chastity and obedience. When women were accused of crimes, especially adultery or impropriety, the punishments targeted not only their bodies, but their reputation. Adulterous women could be divorced, cast out, and barred from participating in religious rituals. To lose access to sacred rites was a spiritual exile, cutting them off from both the gods and their community. In some cases, women were humiliated more directly. They might be paraded publicly or marked by rumor, their shame becoming a permanent scar in the eyes of society. What is striking is that while men often faced physical punishment, women's penalties were designed to control their sexuality and status. They were punished not simply for their acts, but for threatening the male-dominated order of the polis. Foreigners, or metics, occupied a strange space in Greek law. They could live, trade, and even prosper in cities like Athens, but they lacked the rights of citizens. This meant that in courts, they were always at a disadvantage. For crimes committed against citizens, foreigners often faced harsher sentences than natives. Where a citizen might be fined or exiled, a foreigner might be flogged or executed. Their lack of political power meant they had little defense. At the same time, foreigners could easily be accused of impiety, introducing foreign gods or practices that threatened the city's traditions. These accusations were dangerous, for they struck at the city's identity itself. A foreigner suspected of corrupting the youth or undermining religion risked exile at best, death at worst. The differences between citizens and non-citizens highlight the core of Greek justice. It was not blind. Punishment was tied to status. A wealthy citizen might argue his way out of exile with eloquence, while a poor slave could be whipped to death for a similar offense. Even within citizenship, wealth and class played roles. The rich could sometimes pay fines instead of suffering physical punishment, while the poor felt the lash. Justice, then, was not evenly balanced scales. It was tilted by power, privilege, and position. Socrates' death is often seen as a miscarriage of justice, but it also shows the limits of privilege. As a citizen, he was granted a trial and a dignified execution by poison, rather than stoning or torture. Yet his citizenship did not save him from the ultimate penalty. His case reminds us that while status could shape punishment, even the most privileged were not beyond the reach of the Polis. Religion and sacrilege, crimes against the divine. For the Greeks, crime was not merely a legal matter, it was a spiritual one. To insult or offend the gods was not a private sin, but a public danger. The gods, jealous and easily angered, could unleash plagues, droughts, or defeat in war if they felt dishonored. Thus, crimes against the divine were treated with extraordinary severity. To commit sacrilege or impiety was to endanger not only yourself, but the survival of the polis itself. The Greeks lived in a world saturated with religion. Every household had its shrines, every city its temples, every festival its gods. To act impiously was to disturb the cosmic balance. This crime, known as asebia, impiety, was among the most feared. Impiety could take many forms: mocking the gods, desecrating altars, neglecting sacrifices, or even introducing new and foreign deities that threatened tradition. Philosophers who questioned divine order, like Socrates, were seen as corrupting the city from within. The punishment was often death or exile, for such crimes could not be forgiven. The city had to cleanse itself of the pollution before divine wrath struck. Among the most unforgivable crimes was sacrilege, the theft or desecration of sacred property. Temples were not merely buildings, they were the dwelling places of gods, filled with offerings, treasures, and sacrifices meant to sustain divine favor. To rob a temple was to rob a god. Such criminals were considered cursed, their very touch polluted. Punishments for sacrilege were almost always execution, often accompanied by torture. In some cases, their bodies were denied burial, left unburied as further dishonor. Greek writers describe temple robbers pursued not only by the city's justice, but by divine vengeance. Even if the thief escaped punishment by men, he would be struck by misfortune, madness, or ruin, proof that the gods themselves took revenge. One of the most famous religious scandals in Athens was the desecration of the Eleusinian mysteries, sacred rites dedicated to Demeter and Persephone. Participation in these mysteries was considered a privilege, and secrecy was absolute. In 415 BCE, during the Peloponnesian War, a group of men in Athens was accused of mocking the mysteries, performing parodies of the sacred rites in drunken revelry. The city erupted in outrage. The crime was seen not merely as blasphemy, but as a threat to Athens' divine protection in wartime. Punishments were swift and severe. Some accused were executed, others exiled, their property confiscated. The scandal shook Athens to its core, showing just how seriously sacrilege was taken. Legacy of Greek punishments, how they echoed through history. When we look back at the punishments of ancient Greece, the floggings, the public shaming, the exiles, and the poison cups, It is easy to imagine them locked in the past, but the truth is, these practices and the philosophies behind them did not die with Athens or Sparta. They echoed through Roman law, medieval justice, and even modern concepts of punishment, shaping the very way societies think about crime and order. The Romans, inheritors of Greek culture in so many ways, adopted and adapted many Greek ideas of justice. Public punishment, for example, remained central in Rome. The spectacle of the amphitheatre, where criminals, slaves, and enemies of the state were executed before cheering crowds, was a direct continuation of the Greek principle that justice must be visible. Exile, too, was carried into Roman law, where banishment became a common penalty for elites who displeased the Senate. Like the Greeks, the Romans saw exile as both punishment and purification, removing the dangerous presence without shedding citizen blood. Even the execution of Socrates had echoes in Rome. When statesmen like Cicero debated philosophy and law, they looked to Socrates' trial as both a warning and a lesson in the limits of free speech under political power. In medieval Europe, punishments often carried the same dual purpose of correction and purification that had marked Greek justice. The flogging of heretics, the burning of witches, and the shaming of adulterers all drew from the Greek idea that crime was not only a breach of law but a disturbance of divine order. The ritual of public punishment, the criminal displayed, mocked, and destroyed before the eyes of the community, was almost identical to the Greek theatre of justice in the agora. Even centuries later, law and religion remained inseparable. When modern legal systems began to emerge in Europe, they carried traces of Greek ideas. The concept of a trial by jury, for example, has roots in the Athenian system, where large citizen juries decided guilt and punishment. The idea of exile as a cleaner punishment found echoes in penal colonies like Australia centuries later. Even our fascination with public trials, broadcast on television, dissected in newspapers, is a legacy of the Greek belief that justice is not private but communal, that it must be performed for all to see. The death of Socrates remains one of the most influential punishments in history. His calm acceptance of execution became a cornerstone of philosophical thought about justice, law, and the relationship between the individual and the state. Socrates' trial continues to provoke questions. Should a man obey laws even when they are unjust? Is death preferable to exile or silence? Can punishment ever truly purify, or is it simply vengeance in disguise? These are questions that societies still grapple with today. One of the most striking legacies of Greek punishment is its role as storytelling. Every flogging, every exile, every execution was not just about the criminal, but about the message it sent. The story of Socrates, the scandal of the Eleusinian mysteries, the humiliation of adulterers, all became cautionary tales that endured in memory. This storytelling aspect lives on. Modern justice still uses punishment as a lesson, whether through media coverage, public statements, or symbolic sentences. The Greeks taught us that punishment is never just about the individual, it is about the community, the narrative, the warning to others. Imagine being transported through time, first to Athens, where exile or flogging awaits you, then to Rome, where the amphitheatre looms, then to medieval Europe, where heresy burns at the stake, then to the modern world, where prison walls close you in. Though the methods change, the essence remains. Punishment has always been about power, spectacle, and control. The Greeks simply made this truth clear, turning justice into ritual and performance. The punishments of ancient Greece may shock us, but they also remind us of the deep roots of our own systems. When we debate the death penalty, the purpose of prisons, or the spectacle of public trials, we are echoing conversations the Greeks began over 2,000 years ago. Their punishments were brutal, humiliating, and sometimes fatal, but they were also foundational, shaping the way civilizations after them understood crime, justice, and the balance between individual freedom and the demands of the state. In the end, The question is not just whether you would survive the punishments of ancient Greece, but whether you can recognize their shadow in the punishments of our own time.